to Mr. Richard. The ambassador mentioned Iraq has been absent from this conversation for the past few years, but it's a well-known fact that countries most impacted by climate change are not the ones most responsible for the climate crisis. Are there World Bank programs designed with the inequity in mind? In Iraq, are projects discussed with sensitivity to Iraq's position as a climate change victim?
Thank you. Thank you. So I hope you hear me fine, and thanks for the invitation and this the question. So it's a tough question to ask the World Bank, because we pride ourselves on being an institution that is responsive to the country's development needs, regardless of considerations such as the ones that you're putting forward. In a sense, what we're saying is that we are always ready to support a country like Iraq. What counts for us is really so I'll give you an example. When we put out this report recently, which is called the Country Climate and Development Report, it was done for a first batch of 40 countries based on the impact of climate change, of course, and Iraq was among those 40 by default. I mean, the region itself counts a number of these countries, but definitely Iraq is at the top of our concerns. So this is still, oh yeah, there you go. This is much better, sorry. So I was just saying that, I'll just repeat a little bit because the mic was not, I wasn't close enough to the mic. So I was saying that the bank putting out its reports on climate and development put Iraq among the highest priority countries because of the impacts. I mean, the climate change issue, as you mentioned, there's always two aspects to it: the contribution through carbon emissions, and then the impacts, mainly through the increase in temperature and the impacts on the stresses on the water cycle. And the response to that, as we say, is mitigation and adaptation, and the position of a country towards those two aspects of climate change are never the same. Regardless, I think what's important to keep in mind here is simply, and that's what we are putting forward, is, you know, what should Iraq be doing anyway? On the mitigation side, I think on what's important for Iraq in a way is the logic of mitigation is an important one, but there's also an economic opportunity logic to it. Iraq is in a big oil producer, actually a largely oil-dependent economy, in a world that is progressively decarbonizing, and that's going to put an enormous pressure and strain on fossil fuels and in general, and on oil-producing countries in particular. So more than any sense of obligation or equity, I would say that there's a sense of simple economic stewardship and economic opportunity for Iraq to look at the decarbonization agenda. Now, behind the word decarbonization are a number of things that have been put forward for Iraq. I would say that His Excellency mentioned the gas flaring, which is one of the, so I actually went to Basra for the first time last week for the Basra conference. There's no better way of understanding the extent of the gas flaring issue than simply landing and driving through Basra and realizing that you're surrounded by pretty significant gas flares, something that is heavily regulated in most developed countries. Now again, you know, gas flaring is it's both an environmental and an economic issue. There's an environmental impact and impacts on climate change, also simple wasted resource for Iraq that it could tap into using technologies that are widely available. So that's also one way. I'm just saying there's always this tension between looking at something as responding to a crisis, but also looking at something as a common sense actions that Iraq should take. Same thing on renewables. Iraq has tremendous solar potential and wind potential, and these are energies that are emerging, that are creating jobs, that are helping countries develop and so that type of diversification simply makes sense for Iraq. In a way, you could almost say that mitigation becomes a corollary benefit of what should be a positive economic strategy for a country like Iraq. And that's the way we look at it. On the adaptation side, I would say this is where the two are indistinguishable. The notion of responding to a scarcity crisis and the notion of doing it for economic development is basically the same. And this is where I believe that Iraq, the government and the population are feeling the impacts of climate change the most, right? In terms of the water scarcity, the impacts on the economy, of course, but also on people, on migration, on livelihoods. All these impacts are, have been widely studied, including by the World Bank, and they have accentuated pretty considerably in the past 2 to 3 years. And they clearly add a huge strain on an economy that has already been strained by 20 years of conflict, 2-3 years of COVID, wide displacement of populations, refugees. So all of these crises add up and are now compounded by the dwindling of a pretty fundamental resource for the economy and the lives of Iraqi people. And that's a much clearer case for something that Iraq has to address pretty urgently, that we are ready to support, of course, and that would also be fundamental for the development of the country.